depending upon where you are, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Ali Shivji. I'm one of the principals at Optima Living, and very excited to be here today to speak about a very important topic, one that revolves around support networks. The idea of caregivers and their importance, but also the need for support networks for our caregivers. And so if you're a caregiver, if you have a loved one that you care for in any sort of way, this is probably a very important conversation for you to be part of or to be able to watch. Very pleased and honored to have two very distinguished guests with us today. The first is Dr. Jasneet Parmar, who actually, cause for celebration, has just been promoted to full professor at the University of Alberta. And as part of that, her role specializes or is really focused on specialized geriatric programs within the Department of Family Medicine. Jasneet, great to have you today. And also we have Dr. Adrian Wagg, who is the University of Alberta he is the chair of healthy aging, and is always a pleasure to have on board, and looking forward to the discussion we have planned for you in this regard. So let's jump right in, and Jasneet, maybe I'll start with you. If you can take us through what is the definition of a caregiver? And how does one, if they feel like they're in denial, how does one know that they actually are a caregiver?
Thank you, Ali. And may I begin by thanking you for this invitation and this opportunity. We are speaking to a very important topic today, and I'm glad to contribute to it. Family caregivers are those who generally provide an unpaid caregiving role to people who are suffering from mental or physical illnesses, who may have disabilities or age-related needs. This caregiving can take the form of practical support, emotional support, financial support. It is often provided by family members. However, it can be provided by friends and neighbors. And this term family caregivers can be used interchangeably. You may hear of them being called care partners, carers, and sometimes informal caregivers, even though there is nothing informal about what they do.
And maybe tell me a little bit more about why is it that we should talk about the idea of a support network for effectively a support network? Because as I would see it, caregivers themselves are the support network to individuals who are needing of that care or that support. But today I think we really wanted to focus in on the caregivers themselves and the help that they need, the support network that they need. And why is that important?
So while most family caregivers want to provide care, and most of them find it satisfying and rewarding, they do it out of love, duty, reciprocity. They take up a wide array of activities when it comes to support, and it can run the gamut. It can be practical support, day-to-day support when it comes to basic function of someone, such as dressing, washing, grooming. It can be running errands and providing transportation. It can be supporting healthcare needs. It can be providing emotional support and socialization, and often financial support. And what happens is the load and length of this caregiving can have negative consequences, a negative impact on the family caregivers, and it can take its toll on their mental health, physical health, financial health. If they're working, it may impact their work. They may reduce their working hours. They may exit completely from work. So as a society, we take caregiving as something that we want to honor and we want to continue providing. And most families, both at an individual level and as families, as a unit, want to provide the support. However, what we have to recognize are the consequences of this caregiving. and how it's impacting family caregivers. And if we are looking at sustaining their caregiving role, we have to take into account also what it is doing to their mental health, to their overall well-being and their quality of life.
May I ask maybe what may be termed for some a silly question, but if we're fortunate enough to live in Canada, if fortunate enough to live in a social healthcare system that should cover all of our needs and take care of everything that we need as we age, why do we even need caregivers? Like shouldn't the system be set up in a way that if I get old or if I need care, the system should provide for me?
That's an excellent question. What we often don't take into account is amount of caregiving being provided by family caregivers. So if you just look in Alberta, 25% of Albertans now are providing family caregiving. And in this role, they are providing close to 400 million hours of care. And the imputed cost of this caregiving is $5.8 billion at the last count a few years ago. So if you look at what the family caregivers are providing, they literally are the shadow workforce of our society, and they are the backbone of our healthcare system. We actually could not sustain what we are doing in the healthcare system if we didn't have family caregivers. And people who are living in wherever they're living, and caregiving cuts across the entire continuum of care, they could not maintain their quality of life, their function without this caregiving support. So in today's day and age, there is no system in place right now that can replace what family caregivers are providing.
Let's maybe for the sake of our conversation today, let's pick a fictional person named Jane. And Jane doesn't know it yet, but Jane is going to have to become a caregiver for her significant other in the next 6 to 12 months. So if we were going to be proactive, what types of things would you advise Jane to start thinking about to create that support network for herself in advance of this impending need to become a caregiver? And how would we think then about what is the ideal support network and how you would create it?
In fact, one thing I think, Jasneet, that Ali mentioned is, and that we should reinforce, that often the caregiver, care recipient is a very isolating phenomenon. People feel that they can't get away from that caregiving role, and often feel that they're forced to withdraw from their usual network. So almost it's a created silo, isn't it? And maintaining that connectedness is really important.
Absolutely, Adrian. And there's no question that family caregivers, as they continue in their caregiving role, they get more and more isolated, and they often lose their own identity. And this happens for a variety of reasons. So I'll come back to your question later, Ali, because I think if we explain what goes on in the lives of caregivers over time, it will help us understand why the social networks are so important in helping them maintain their own health and well-being. So over time, what happens, and this applies to older adults as well, not just to family caregivers, but there is generally a loss of one is time. They don't have the time to maintain their usual social engagement and participation because their caregiving role consumes so much of their time. The other is they may also have their own health difficulties. So when it comes to family caregivers, we should not look at them as a homogeneous population. Family caregiving is now being provided anywhere by all ages. So it can range from young teens, young adults, to spouses who are in their 80s and 90s. So as you age, even as family caregivers, and there's a large cohort of the older people providing family caregiving, not just to older people in turn, but they're also sometimes providing caregiving to adult children who have disabilities or grandchildren if there are skipped generations. There is a loss of relationships over time. They have their own health difficulties. Some of them retire, so they lose the connections at work. Others may have lack of resources, and they have difficulty accessing resources such as transportation. At times, you have the family cohesiveness may get affected because there may be relationship breakdown. And then there is also, we've got this phenomenon of beanpole families, because more and more children move away over time. So there's a wide variety of reasons why family caregivers can get isolated and get lonely, and thus face increasing difficulty in maintaining their own health and well-being.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's a really important fact, because I think rarely do people spend enough time understanding that one of the biggest challenges for our healthcare system today and for our environment of aging is actually not those who are in immediate need of care. It's actually the caregivers, and us not spending enough time ensuring that they're set up for success and for long-term success. Because if they get burnt out, if they are the ones that ultimately get sick, and in some cases, and it's not even that rare, but in some cases the caregiver ends up passing away, or something ends up happening to the caregiver instead of the one being cared for, and that changes the dynamics altogether. And so it's an interesting thing to think about. So I guess if we were to then think about this in the context of, we've talked about why we should support them. We've talked a little bit about the types of support they need. Coming then back to Jane, if you will, what would be the support networks that you would advise someone to be proactive about setting up for themselves?
In the healthcare system, we do provide some supports to family caregivers. Again, government provides a certain amount of supports. And then there are community organizations who also provide social supports. However, there is one area that we don't talk enough of, and is the topic of discussion today, and that is social support networks. And I think before we go into what are the types of these networks and what are the facilitators and barriers of these networks, is to understand what are they. So social support networks are groups of people known to family caregivers, known to older adults, known to anyone, it could be of any age, with whom they have close links, who have potential of providing support. And these support activities can vary. So it could be in the form of just pure social engagement, or it could be emotional support. And from time to time, it could actually be care-related support. Sometimes it is actually replacing them as a caregiver and supporting the care recipient. And other times, it's a form of running support for the caregiver, such as running errands and providing transportation, etc. So I think we don't talk enough about how important these social networks can be in supporting family caregivers. And what we know is that these social support networks improve social and emotional well-being, cognitive function, increase physical activities, and in turn decrease physical health risk, increase depression, anxiety, and even decrease depression and anxiety, and even decrease suicide risk. So that I just wanted to talk about the importance, what are social networks, and the value they bring to the lives of family caregivers and other people.
Kind of my head goes in a couple of places. I mean, Adrian, I wanted to ask you about what your experiences have been with social support networks and what differences you see amongst people that maybe you interact with that may have or not have social support networks. And then I want to talk a little bit about how does one set up goals for their network? How do they actually make, create the right social support network for themselves, and how do they know that they're there, and how do they do that part? So it's probably a two-part question, but.
Well, I think Jasneet has illustrated the consequences of poorly connected individuals and caregivers very, very eloquently. And we know that the consequences of both social isolation and loneliness, and they're slightly different, because clearly you can be socially isolated and not lonely. People who declare themselves as lonely have a very different, or a related but slightly different set of adverse health consequences. But it's undoubtedly that this idea of pulling together a socially connected individuals do better for all the reasons as Jasneet's talked about. And that might be individuals or their caregivers.
Well, I was just going to say, have you seen the benefits or the tangible differences between individuals that you may interact with that have and don't have a support network?
It's always very difficult on an individual level to experience that. But we have data from communities and populations, and Jasneet noted that even suicidal ideation and suicidality in older people is reduced where there is good social connection. On an individual basis, yes, we all have experience of, for instance, in the caregiver zone, where people do withdraw because they don't see an alternative to, they may gain the rewards of caregiving. It's what is expected, but they then withdraw, and should the person for whom they provide care then die, they're left completely isolated. And a recent experience of mine, it's taken the spouse of a recently deceased chap up to 2 years to start to regain those social connections and really being at sea. And as Jasneet said, we've seen tremendous demographic change, lots more singletons, people living alone. We're creating individual cells, almost. And then I think Jasneet will give us some very practical advice on how to create and maintain social connectedness. There are sex differences. Men tend to be much more socially ill-connected than women in general, and we've seen specific ventures to encourage men. There's the idea of the men's sheds in many community centres where like-minded men will get together in smaller groups because they're much less apt to join group things. I mean, Jasneet, I'm sure you have perspective. How do you encourage someone to maintain and create social connectedness in very practical terms?
And certainly, that's what we need to promote. No question. How do we maintain social networks? So if we begin to understand who's involved in these social support networks, it helps us to then promote this support system. Often it is close family. Okay, so part of this social support network is close family. It can be extended family. It can definitely be friends, neighbors, and it can be organized institutions. It can be the church. It can be your community health center. It can be the seniors centers in your neighborhood. It can actually be your neighborhood. So having an age-friendly neighborhood actually promotes social engagement. Now, what has been shown, and I'm sorry, I'm putting my research hat on here, is that people who have mixed social support networks do the best. So mixed social support networks constitute of family and friends and organized activities. So if I may put a plug in to promote that concept. So one, as you get older, I would suggest encouraging you to maintain your social networks. It does require a certain degree of effort, and we can go into what facilitates maintaining these networks. but promoting these mixed social support networks has shown to have the best outcomes. These networks are the ones that have been shown to improve both physical, mental health, and overall quality of life. Then there are, and actually 61%, so about 60% of people have these mixed social support networks. It's just that we tend to lose them as we get older or when we become family caregivers. So think of when you're maybe younger, or maybe when you're not family caregiving, think of these close links that you have in your life. And what we promote is, finding ways to maintain them. There are, of course, people who only have support networks that are close kin. So about 15% of people will have only family members as part of their network, and then about 10% have non-kin. So they have no family members involved, but they have neighbors and such, friends and neighbors involved in supporting them. All networks are good. All of them are valuable. However, the ones associated with the best outcomes are the mixed, where you have family and you have friends and you have organized activities in your life.
How do you go about, so I can just imagine, let's talk about Sarah again, just as a hypothetical situation. I can just imagine Sarah's partner gets sick. She starts to care for that partner. She starts to basically put aside the things that were important to her in her life in order to do that, right? Maybe it's, okay, I'm going to go, one day it's to the doctor's appointment, one day it's to other stuff. And it's almost like it's a slow snowball that gets you into the role of a caregiver. I don't know that, I don't know what percentage it would be, but I'm sure that there's a pretty large percentage of people who didn't think they were going to be a caregiver, didn't anticipate it, but end up, in that position. And then there probably is a level of between exhaustion, embarrassment, or others, you do tend to get isolated. You do tend to kind of step away from the world. How does she get back in the world? How does she feel comfortable enough to say, okay, I need to go and actually set up a support network? And maybe the first thing is like, what are some of the, well, first of all, how would you go about setting up your own network? And then what are some of the challenges that stop you from doing so that we should be aware of and that we should talk about and make sure people are aware of?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, Jasneet? Because we both have seen, even when the caregiving role changes, such as when the care recipient becomes institutionalized, you're almost preaching a counterintuitive sermon in you need to maintain your own life and your own sense of identity, because we see many caregivers try and continue that role whilst their loved one is in a nursing home. So they have no time to themselves and continue that withdrawal. And you're almost saying, well, don't do what your intuition is telling you. Maintain your own sense of self and well-being and sense of worth. And I think a lot of Jasneet's work, I think, has been really useful in Alberta in terms of the supports and making the information available. But you're right, is how do we get people to go and drink the water? And it's often a very self-reflective, what are my thoughts, what are my emotions, how am I going to deal with that, and how am I going to be honest about how this is affecting me and what can I do that's proactive? I mean, how do you deal with that, Jasneet?
What I suggest to family caregivers is to lean in. You got to lean into the connections you have around you to look for these social support networks. So what we are promoting, and thank you, Adrian, for bringing attention to that, is building a better system of support around these family caregivers. So these family caregivers are not alone in maintaining their own health and well-being and creating and maintaining these social networks. Because for the longest time, our tendency was to foster resilience in family caregivers by helping them pull themselves up by their bootstraps, so to speak. What family caregivers have said is, don't try to build a better family caregiver, build a better system around us. So I say to the family caregivers, this system now is being created and is building around you. Now you've got to lean into it. Now, some of it is at an individual level. So it is the motivation of the family caregiver as well as their fears, right? However, a lot of family caregivers, if you establish rapport with them, if you have a trusting relationship, you can help them overcome those fears. Then it's a matter of leaning into those support systems that now are available around you. From the healthcare perspective, Adrian and I, we are all engaged now in training healthcare providers to support family caregivers. So for the longest time, our focus was patients. Now we are looking at how do we support them. So you can always talk to your family doctor, you can talk to your case manager, your social worker, whoever is involved in your lives when it comes to the healthcare system, and asking about supports. Then there are these community organizations. So there's a lot more available. Almost every community organization, which is disease specific, such as Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's and Huntington's and ALS and MS, they all are starting to look at supporting family caregivers. And then there's Caregivers Alberta, which is a standalone organization just for family caregivers. Call them and you can ask for advice and suggestions and also get emotional support and navigation. Government has a 211 line. Call the 211 line. So lean into what now has been made available to you. And absolutely, if you have age-friendly communities, it's accessing what's available in your community. Not everybody is fortunate to have such age-friendly neighborhoods, but if you do, access what's available, the library, the senior centers, and other facilities that allow you to exercise and get socially engaged. So these are just some examples, Ali. However, there are barriers to this, and perhaps we can talk about those as well.
Yeah, no, totally. I've talked about the barriers. Just before I get there, though, because of all, I think that the easiest one is to make sure that we just spend 2 seconds on the resources that are available, that almost the places that you recommend people look first. And so you talked a little bit about 211. I didn't even know 211 existed. I know 311, I know 811, I know 911. I guess 411 doesn't exist as much anymore. But okay, so 211, maybe tell us a little bit more about that part. And then where are some of the other places that you would recommend, even from a website or other resources that we could give people? And I mean, I heard you talk about Caregivers Alberta, but what are your top 3, if you will, of places to look for resources if I was, a newly promoted caregiver, if you will, and now needed to think about what resources I need around me?
So top 3, and this is just from the top of my head from my experience, I would suggest family caregivers call Caregivers Alberta. Just Google it and you'll find their number. They're very, very responsive. And others around the family caregivers can help support, make those referrals. So Caregivers Alberta has made it very easy. It's a referral form, like people like Adrian and I, so long we have the consent of the family caregiver, we can just pop it in, send it off, and they call within a day. Yeah. So that's one. The other is 211. It has the inventory of resources. These people are informed about this wide range of resources that are available across Alberta. They can get one-on-one navigation of these resources. So it's an excellent repository of information, and it keeps growing. And the third one is a newly launched platform called Core Alberta, C-O-R-E. And this is becoming the repository, and this is going online. So it's not calling someone, but it's going online and looking at repository of resources. Now, sometimes family caregivers will have, and others, it's designed for older adults and family caregivers, they may have difficulty navigating online resources. So, and that's one of the barriers of creating social support networks is navigation of those resources that are being made available to them. So sometimes they have to look for support, and I would suggest they ask for support if they are not overly tech friendly. I'm not personally, and they can ask for their children, their grandchildren, even friends, the social and healthcare providers that they interact with to navigate the online supports. And once they get, what we find is they learn quickly. So once you give them that hand up with technology, then once they're familiar with it, then they enjoy it, and then they're off to the races.
So what are some of the barriers? What are some of the things that stop people from being able to really set things up properly? I mean, we've talked a little bit about them in terms of things, but are there other barriers or challenges that we should speak about?
When caregiving absorbs all your time or most of your time, and the pandemic showed us that, we did a survey last year. We are redoing it now, but last year when the pandemic hit, within a couple of months, we did a survey, and the survey showed that the care work of family caregivers living in the community or caring for in the community doubled, if not tripled. So you're looking at providing, 2 to 3 full-time jobs if you're in the community and family caregiving to people with high needs. So, but not all of them have high needs, and their care work hours can vary. So time. So, however, what can we do to give them the gift of time? How can they themselves find the gift of time? And that's where these social support networks become important. So no question, if you are you're connected to the healthcare system and you're on home care, you can ask for respite care. And that really helps give them the time to do things that they need to do for themselves. What families often depend on, and that's where these social support networks are critical, is this network of family and friends and sometimes neighbors. I'll give you a story about a church member involved in providing the support. It's these people who actually can provide take over some of the care, and so that's when we start calling these social support networks almost care networks, because they can step in and provide care, which gives the caregiver time to do some self-care, to have some social engagement, to go out and do social activities that may improve their own mental well-being, perhaps contribute in some manner somewhere else, that again, like volunteering, that improves their mental well-being, go for some get some physical exercise that improves their physical well-being, etc. So as much as possible, these social networks, if you have people involved who really care, who understand your needs, who you have good rapport and trust with, often these are the ones that step up and give you that gift of time so you can go do something for yourself.
So we've talked a little bit about the importance of creating social support networks, their importance to caregivers themselves. But let's talk a little bit about the idea of the importance of social support networks to individuals who are living within congregate living environments. It could be nursing homes, it could be assisted living communities, it could be retirement communities. But tell me about some of both the importance as well as how someone could set up a social support network for themselves if they're living within a congregate living environment. How would you start to approach that?
Well, I think we've probably both seen very different approaches, often initiated by the partner of or family member of the loved one who's gone into nursing care. And often these social networks are then this thing called a complex adaptive system. They move and fluctuate, and new networks arise. So you have the relationships with the care aides and the team that are providing care for your loved one. You have care partner to care partner networks, and often we've seen friendships struck up between family caregivers who are there to see their family members, who then socialize. So it's almost a recreation of a different social network of support when the original one, because all the things that Jasneet and I were talking around about, loss of role, are recreated in a different environment. And that happens awfully frequently.
Yeah, and I find that what people underestimate is the power of the resources available to you when you do move into a congregate living environment. I think people tend to disregard that, and sometimes people tend to disregard the fact that it might actually be the best thing for the quality of life of their loved one. They say, okay, well, I want to keep them at home and I want to care for them at home, and at some point you realize that actually the better answer is to put them into an environment where they are surrounded by both that support network, by the people, and by the environment where they are encouraged and engaged at their level by many people, not just one.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Ali. And it's not, aging at home is not conducive or appropriate for everyone. And we recognize that. And sometimes it is better for the adult to move into a congregate setting. And we have a variety of congregate settings, right? We have lodges, we have private supportive living, we have designated supportive living, and we have long-term care. Regardless, it is, as Adrian said, it is a relocation. Now you're lucky if that congregate, it's actually, it's beneficial if that congregate facility is in the community you lived in. So then you're familiar with the neighborhood and what is available to you. And if you're a family caregiver, then you don't have to travel far, right, to visit the resident. However, often that's not the case. But all is not lost. These congregate facilities can actually provide for a lot of social interactions, social participation, and even social contribution. So when we talk about socialization, we sometimes forget about this social capital we have in contributing to the care of others. So Adrian raised a really good example, and I've been party to that. So my dad was in a nursing home before he passed away for 4 months. We looked after him for 8 years at home, and finally we couldn't, and it was the right thing for him to do. It was the appropriate place to care for him. And I would go every evening after work and spend like 4 to 5 hours with him and do all kinds of things with him. My social network, because I lost my time to do other activities that I would normally do in the evenings and weekends because I was spending all my time with dad. But I gained a social network in 2 sets of people. One were the healthcare providers. So the healthcare attendants and LPNs became my friends. So I would chat in the way in, they would give me an update on dad, I would give contributions to his care, etc. They would comment on my clothes, they'd look forward to what I'm wearing, often, I would bring in something for them to share with them, which they again appreciated. And it actually was an experience that helped my emotional distress, that social support from the healthcare providers, just that engagement with me for, few minutes, every few hours, gave me immense emotional relief. The other was the other family caregivers. So I became friends with family caregivers of residents on my dad's unit, and we would chat and share experiences. And they would tell me what may have happened during the day with my dad, and they'd check in on him if I wasn't around, etc. And sometimes the residents themselves became party to that. So if they were able to, they would also engage in those conversations, etc. And I've also found there's a whole variety of activities that are offered to the residents. So once again, it may require some motivation. It may require some support some are inherently motivated to participate in some such activities. Others may need to be encouraged. And I've started to say now to older people as they move into these congregate settings, because there's a variety, as I said, of settings, is go explore what that setting offers in the form of social engagement, participation, maybe contribution, where they can actually get involved in care or contribute to other social activities at that center, and what they may even offer as support systems, because these centers have started, these facilities have started to have support groups and sessions with family caregivers. So there's much to be gained if you were to move into a good setting.
I mean, we've seen that, Ali, haven't we, at Astor Gardens, with the lady sitting on her own who said she wanted to go and play table tennis, but cognitively impaired, but within 20 minutes was being engaged by the rest of the people and playing. You know, we're social animals. Put us all together, something will happen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think there's great examples. I mean, Astor Gardens also, you know, we opened up the rooftop patio a couple weeks ago, and the amount of people who are now on the putting green or who are out there having drinks or wanting to just be around in a social environment is incredible. Or, you know, just at our site in our community in Vancouver and Wisteria Place, it's got a beautiful kind of like Japanese garden with a koi pond and people out there engaging and doing yoga and doing different events, and it's very incredible to see how.
Presumably not fishing.
Probably not fishing yet. Well, we are worried about that. We have to think about, you know, ways to avoid that part, including the birds coming in for that matter. But it is incredible to see that people naturally also congregate, and they naturally do things that you don't have to always do yourself. And I think as a caregiver, I think that's one of the biggest ways. That the biggest things we want to remind you of is that as a caregiver, you are not alone. And hopefully this webinar has given everyone a chance to be able to understand that there's both a need for support structures for caregivers, but also the fact that you're not alone. There are many resources to help you, and many ways and many opportunities that you probably have not, you know, many stones you may not have unturned, probably because you haven't had the time to do so. And so hopefully this has given you the chance to accelerate that learning process and go from there. And Jasneet, Adrian, very nice to have you both, and thank you so much for taking the time. And hopefully this was helpful and part of the knowledge series that we continue to develop on meaningful topics for our residents, families, and stakeholders.